Thank you for giving me a chance to speak today. And the title of my talk is Making Sense of Being. And it's about Edith Stein's philosophy and the dialogue between faith and science. Now, this little bird is meant to be a bit of an image in order to show with the inquisitive look that this bird has, the degree of my interest in this topic. But of course, in the setting of experts on the philosophy of Edith Stein, I feel like that my knowledge of her philosophy really is represented by this little bird brain. So I will not talk a great deal about Edith Stein's philosophy, but more specifically as to why, for me, as somebody who is interested in faith and science, her philosophy is so very important, and how I believe that her work can help me to make sense of faith and science, and specifically in a Franciscan way, and the value of creatures and creation that Franciscan theology and spirituality has so well documented. So my specific problem is, how can we make sense of nature? And the context for this problem is Christian faith and scientific technological culture, which has a very distinct way of looking at nature, and it challenges us in a way that is quite new. And my approach is to use Edith Stein's philosophy specifically to recover a teleological understanding of scientifically understood being, so to see purpose in creatures, to see direction in natural activities, which is alien to scientifically understood being, but very important to make sense in a truly human way of natural being. And we'll at least touch on practical applications, and the general context is the question of environmental integrity, very important in today's age, and embodied human dignity, another very important question that needs to be considered. Now, how can we make sense of nature and respond meaningfully to nature? Now, I put 4 options on the slide, and the first 3 options are options I do not like very much, but I'll mention them for comprehensiveness. Now, the first option is to value nature strictly as a material resource for us to use, and that really means embrace the scientific technological culture to its fullness. But really, there's always been in philosophy this tension between life, survival, and the good life, living well. And that is not as easy to really reconcile in a scientifically technological mindset, because mere survival clearly has been revealed as not being adequate, and really the good life has been the driving force for scientific technological culture, but there's now this tension between the two. So how do we reconcile that? Then comes option 2, also quite popular today, which is to speak of Mother Nature. And we embrace Mother Nature and follow our feelings. Now, this completely falls short of the reality of nature, which is not so very maternal at all. Indeed, I often wonder what kind of mother image do people have who speak of Mother Nature. My mother was nowhere near like nature in this sense. So, and of course, feelings like this are irredeemably singular. We really can't go there. The third option is also characteristic for our scientific technological age, which is simply maintain nature in its original diversity and try to minimize the human impact on nature. But this really places nature in opposition to us and assumes that our life is entirely under our own control. That's not a response, it's not a dialogue with nature, it's not an interaction with nature, not a response. So really, not so good either. So option 4 is the one that I want to recommend. Since being, the simple fact of being, is known first of all as a human being, we have to understand natural being, the other creatures we share our being with, to be expressed through understanding of human being. And this means a teleological, a purposeful understanding of nature, and even an enchanted understanding of nature. The presence of spirit in nature is possible and necessary. And it can be understood, natural being, in terms of community and relationship with each other, yes, but most importantly, with God. So what does this mean for Christian faith and the scientific theological culture? Faith and science are not in conflict. This has been recognized by many. We have to recognize that faith and science are not at all in conflict, but the personal self in a disenchanted nature has lost a teleological understanding of her life. And I'm just dropping these two big names, Charles Taylor and Alistair MacIntyre, as two philosophers who have spoken of this topic, the self in the modern age by Charles Taylor, or the loss of teleological understanding of life in Alistair MacIntyre's work on the importance of virtue, of a virtue ethic, which is oriented towards acting in a way that really supports goals in nature. It has been documented by many philosophers how the modern age has led to this conflict, even though faith and science are not in conflict. And of course, for people like me with an interest in faith and science, I emphasize that science continues to demonstrate the depth of rationality of being, of making sense of being, but without a Christian enculturation, it really leads into some kind of denial of even individual being, because science by itself really conceals the reality of individual being by drawing all into one global concept. And this leaves Christianity, people of Christian faith, caught between polar opposites, a polytheistic nature spirituality, which really is not Christian. We're not polytheists, obviously. We are Trinitarian, but Trinitarian faith is not polytheism. And utilitarian rationality is, of course, even worse, because it really degrades all kind of being to simply usefulness to whoever happens to be in charge. I just put this well-known poem by Friedrich von Schiller, the God der Griechenlands, the gods of Greece, next to it, to show how this difficulty that I'm talking about is really as old as modernity. It's not contemporary, it's as old as modernity. So what have been the ways of speaking reductively in response to knowledge? And there's modern scientism. Modern scientism really understands material being as grounded in mathematical being, which somehow is understood as being non-contingent in the Platonist sense. Always mathematical, the formulas of mathematics are kind of everlasting. And within this, the human spirit is kind of alien and is contingent. So maybe the human spirit is just contingent individual being that somehow got smuggled into this mathematical nature that is eternally existent, which really is a contrast that cannot be philosophically bridged. A much better reductionism is the one offered by Saint Bonaventure, a famous 13th century Franciscan theologian. And I just mentioned two of his works, his Reduction of the Arts to Theology or The Journey of the Mind into God. Very different works, of course, but they both show how personal being and knowledge, all kinds of knowledge, including scientific knowledge, really comes from and leads back to the triune personal God. So Bonaventure's reductionism, if you allow me to use that word, is really meant to relate all knowledge to divine knowledge, a theological view of knowledge. And Edith Stein's philosophy makes a lot more sense in the context of Bonaventure's theology. And I'll mention a few points from her work, from a philosophy of being, and how it can lead us back to a teleological understanding of scientifically understood being. And there is a phenomenological starting point, which is the human experience of phenomena. We have to have a starting point for any kind of real rational thought of philosophy, of nature, of science. And the human experience has to be recognized as being primary. It cannot be abolished on account of secondary experiences that are derived from it. So I quite agree with Edith Stein and all phenomenologists that the human experience of phenomena must be considered as a starting point for discussion. And she recognizes empathy, personal knowledge of another person, as being constitutive for all knowledge. Empathy is not just some good property that we ought to have. Empathy is much deeper, and it leads us to understand not just our own being, but the being of others, and draws us into community and into the mental life of our own and of the community. The mental life of the individual is inseparable from the life of the community. And lastly, Edith Stein's philosophical journey led her to recognize that life in the world of the living has to be understood within our knowledge of God. This led her to the theological worldview and choosing religious life even. So to go into a bit more detail with the first three of these points, So the human experience is necessary because skeptical empiricism, the human mind who is skeptical of knowledge, can by itself not lead to certain knowledge. You have to accept some unquestionable first principle. And the first principles of certain knowledge are really found in the human experience of reason. And mentality, the ability to think, and life, my self-understanding as a living thinking being, is inseparable from the human experience of being rational, and they are real properties, and they're not just epiphenomena that can be discussed away. They really are foundational for any language of phenomena. The problem now is that if we accept rationality of physics as kind of an upward causality, then there really can't be a downward causality as well, like some emergentist philosophers tend to argue. So a mix of upward and downward causality, kind of upward down, mind downward, and upward up, which is physics upwards, it contradicts physics. It makes nonsense of science. We can't choose that either. There's another problem, which is that individual being is a conceptual paradigm that actually is alien to physics. You may disagree, you may say that's like the physics of the atom, but then it is us who choose an atom as an object of physical study. If you look at physics, then the whole world is drawn into one big global formula, and there are features of this one global worldview, the whole cosmology, but there is not really the being of one thing within the being of the whole in physics. Physics is brutally monotheistic, you could say, in the sense there's only one thing, one physical universe, and nothing in this has its own reality, possesses its own being, or even given its own being, distinct from the being of physics. So that leads to contradictions for philosophers that just can't be reconciled. And this is why the human experience remains the best starting point for philosophical reflection, and modern science takes nothing away from it. Modern science fits quite well into the human experience of nature. And making sense of nature, not more comprehensively, begins in the human experience of nature. And empathy and knowledge are so important because the human self is not just a lone ranger, it's not just a being that just happens to be there by itself. It comes into being through community. We always owe our being, our knowledge of being, through our ability to talk with others, to interact in relationship, to really come into humanness by being raised in community. So empathy is not just a valuable human quality, but an essential prerequisite to reach any kind of understanding, including understanding of ourselves. And as we come to our self-understanding and community, we of course do so by knowing ourselves to be a living body, not just a material thing plus a spirit, but a living body that discovers its own conscious awareness in a bodily experience. And we come to an understanding of ourselves and of others through life in the body. So our own bodily experience is a real experience of material being and matter in general, because matter I know first of all through the matter of my body. And making sense of nature really begins with making sense of the nature of the living human body. Now, what I like about Edith Stein's work on the mental life particularly is that she sees the complexity of mental life very realistically. It's not idealized as an idealized spirit caught in a body, but the mental life of the human spirit is understood realistically as an embodied spirit. And she can abstract from that the life of pure spirits. She shows how angels are possible, but she knows that we are not angels. This is kind of the way I would summarize that. And our attitude to the world, how we relate to other beings, shapes our thoughts, whether we are realistically knowing ourselves as natural beings or idealized as if we were angels. And our thoughts shape our attitude to the world. There's this back and forth in human nature between created experience as a material being and the angelic spirit of pure spirituality. She now understands causality broadly, and this allows us to speak univocally of both physical causality, strictly material causality in non-living matter, and mental causality, without the two getting into conflict, because we understand causality more broadly as just causality as it is understood in physics. And a very particular important point for our relationship to nature, she emphasizes the difference in human society between human community and human society. And she sees how these are distinct concepts of togetherness, because community requires a degree of openness and sharing that strictly abstract society does not have. So our attitude towards natural beings has to remember that. It cannot be an afterthought to kind of try to integrate natural beings into understanding of human nature. It must be fully integrated. The attitude towards natural being must be fully integrated into human life. And then science and technology can find its place within that synthesis. Now, it's important to see the insufficiency of atheological philosophy and therefore the importance of Edith Stein's philosophy. For millennia, philosophical proofs have existed for the existence of God, and they really are meant to show that everybody has a concept of the divine. And in strictly atheistic philosophy, modeled akin to the natural sciences, really risks in divinizing the human self, which is what Edith Stein showed in Martin Heidegger's work. Or it can lead to mathematical first principles, as it does in scientism, which leaves humanity out entirely. Or it ends up spiritualizing nature in ways which are antagonistic to mature theology. It returns to an attempt to spiritualize nature with nature divinities, or all of them together, which is common culture. And this is even messier. And any kind of polytheism really destroys systematic thought. There's a difference between enchanted nature, the presence of divine spirit in the world, and polytheism, which divinizes the divine spirit into multiple divinities. And any kind of polytheism really makes the philosophical enterprise absurd, because it breaks the possibility, the search of unity in the knowledge of the good, of the true, of the beautiful. And Finite and Eternal Being by Stein builds a good synthesis, and modern science can find its place in her synthesis. She does so to some degree herself, but of course her science is based on the early 20th century state of science, early to mid 20th century, which is kind of further developed today, but modern science can still find its place in her synthesis. But there it is clearly understood as partial, instrumental knowledge. It's not an ontology. It is just one aspect of knowledge. And human values, human ethics, and human morality can now be restored in a comprehensive view of a teleologically structured nature. And her philosophy of being distinguishes different modes of being: spiritual being, living being, and material being. And her theology of angels shows that spiritual and immaterial beings are possible within a synthesis, but they're not deities. They're angels, they're not God. They're created beings, which are spiritual beings. And our view of nature now need not exclude them, either on account of science or philosophy. The recognition of spirit as being coexistent with material being allows us to really develop an enchanted theology of nature again. And their reality is no more improbable now than the reality of my own mind. Now, just in closing, I want to give you one concrete example, which is the COVID vaccine fears, which have so much troubled us in more recent political developments. And I want to be very strong in making clear that I strongly support the COVID vaccination efforts, and I see absolutely no reason to be skeptical about COVID vaccination at all. So if you haven't been vaccinated, then I hope you will. But I wanted to pay attention to those who are skeptical about the value of vaccination. And to the left, I put three arguments that I've picked up in discussions and I've heard over and over again. One, the libertarian point of view: my body, my right. I can do whatever I want to do with my body, and I decide what gets in and what not, and my decision is final. Sounds fair enough, but of course, a communicable disease is based in community, and our life is based in community. So it does matter what I do, and why should I have an absolute right to put others at risk? Now, there might be the person who argues, well, I just don't care about any of this. This is kind of ignore the problem approach. I just want to live my life as I've always lived it. Well, you can't. That's kind of the bottom line of pandemics. It's the first pandemic of the scientific technological age, but not the last one. So you cannot simply continue to live your life as you always lived it. You have to deal with it. Now, the third option is again somewhat libertarian in nature. because it assumes that it's all about me and I would almost certainly survive COVID-19 and I choose natural immunity over artificial immunity. Well, there's really no difference between natural immunity and artificial immunity. The whole concept of a natural immunity is really, it doesn't make any sense in our age any longer, where science and technology has given us understanding of immunity that really includes our ability to manipulate immunity in ways that we have understood quite well. And it is just as natural to use our human rationality as it is natural to catch a virus. So we have to integrate the knowledge of nature into natural knowledge, into intuitive natural knowledge, by ensuring that our scientific technological culture values life as is proper to human being. The fear emerges when science and technology has a culture that seems hostile to human life, in a way of trying to alienate human life from that culture. So we have to place the vaccine in the context of a scientific technological culture that values human life. And only then can this vaccine protect us as we want to be protected. And this really requires that what is good for human beings requires understanding humanity's ontological end, where our life is meant to lead us to God through Jesus Christ. So I go back to writing. I'm a Franciscan friar, and on the right-hand side, with very small type, I put the Canticle of Creatures, the summary of Franciscan theology that really sees in all creatures the praise of the glory of God. So I have to go back to writing now and continue writing this paper that I presented to you today about Edith Stein's philosophy and its meaning in the dialogue of faith and science. And my bigger picture, my bigger research project, which is about metaphysics, physics, and the rights of creatures, which is the philosophical foundation of a Franciscan view of the scientifically understood world. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for inviting me to your meeting this year. Thank you.